Why is Germany always portrayed as prime evil in World War One? Now, these are two very different topics, that of evil and aggression, which are completely different discussions in regards to World War One. So we'll tackle each separately. This is going to be a huge, large video because it's a huge topic, so brace yourself. First question is, why does Germany bear war guilt, and why are they given the title of the aggressor? Let's wheel the clock back to 1871 and get an overview from the beginning. Bismarck, after cleverly tricking the French into declaring war, would unite the German states with Prussia, Bavaria, Württemberg, and Saxony leading the charge into a single Germanic state. They would, in the process of peace negotiations, seize the French territories of Alsace-Lorraine, and as the result of the war, Napoleon III would be ousted and the Third Republic would be declared. After this war and the 1866 war with Austria to seize other German lands, Germany would be declared, and they would overnight rise into being a world power. By 1880, they would be the leading industrial power in Europe, and they would be completely surrounded by other great powers. Britain in the sea to the north, France in the west, Austria-Hungary to the south, and Russia to the east. And this is where I briefly mentioned Bismarckian politics, or what is more aptly referenced as the 3/5 rule. That is, Germany must always have alliances with 3 out of the 5 great powers, so as to secure a risk from total encirclement. And in 1879, they would create a defense treaty with Austria-Hungary with regards to the mutual threat of the Russian Empire. In 1887, Bismarck would also secure a non-aggression treaty with said Russian Empire, which would state both parties would remain neutral in each other's respective conflicts unless the other was the aggressor. This was precisely what Bismarck had wanted. He had completely secured his southern and easterly borders. With the addition of Italy to the group, Germany would only have to worry about her French enemies to the west and a potential British threat in the North Sea. When William II ascended his father's throne in 1888, he had very big shoes to fill, and he felt the need to do it on his own with his own new troop of advisors, thus sacking Bismarck to retirement and taking up the reins of diplomacy himself. When, in 1890, Russia rather persistently tried to renew the treaty from a permanent, more alliance-signing one, Wilhelm II would just as persistently refuse. The Russian Tsar, Alexander II, would rightfully so feel exposed and without any friends. The British hated Russia and vice versa because of the Crimean War and Central Asian colonial ambitions. Austria-Hungary was a natural enemy to them because of the conflict in the Balkans, and while Germany was supporting Austria-Hungary, they were also giving Russia the cold shoulder. But France remained, and boy, France will take Russia in with open arms. They created a formal alliance in 1892. Now we can start discussing aggression. This is the formal state of affairs going into the 20th century. Germany and Austria-Hungary have a defensive pact with regards to Russia. France and Russia have a mutual defense treaty against Germany, and the United Kingdom is allied to nobody formally, but is unfriendly to the Russian Empire. It is neutral with the French Republic, and neutral with the leaning of cordial with the Germans. Kaiser Wilhelm and frankly the German people as a whole were incredibly insecure about their status in the world. They were less than 50 years old at this point, and they were bordered by nations which had been around for almost 1,000, and at times can actually trace their history back even further. They had no great national history or prestige to work off of as a unified Germany. They also came into the game late in 1871, well after the 16th and 17th century colonial rushes, which meant they had no colonies. Germany is also a notably isolated region, and as the industrial leader, they relied on foreign imports to keep its factories churning out goods, but perhaps equally important is the concept of prestige. Wilhelm II embarked on a policy of Weltmacht, or world power. A common turn of phrase in Germany was Weltmacht oder Niedergang, world power or downfall. They legitimately believed, the Kaiser, the government, and the people themselves, that it was Germany's time to be the world power. That the German people, through social Darwinism, were the superior, and they were to seize prestige, colonies, and resources through aggression and war. Now, don't conflate this with Nazism, because it wasn't by any means. However, the concept of social Darwinism was a popular one at this time, and it would last well into the 20th century. Now, to get colonies and to secure them, though, you need a navy. So Germany would start a rapid buildup of said navy, and this had a twofold purpose. Number one was to create a colonial fleet to secure shipping lanes and to seize lands through war, and also to secure an alliance with the British. By performing a rapid naval buildup and flexing German muscle combined with a shared cultural heritage, Germany had hoped that Britain would see them as too strong and too culturally similar to be an enemy, and that they would fall right into Germany's arms with an alliance. Does any of that make sense? No, because it doesn't, and it actually failed horrendously. Britain told Germany to stop building up such a massive navy, which was being created for the express intent of contesting British naval hegemony, and Germany repeatedly refused. Now, as the Germans continued to contest British naval hegemony into the 20th century, we get to our first major date. In 1904, the French and the British, already uneasy with the German buildup, would begin to create some of the first legitimate and lasting bonds of friendship in their entire history. It actually wasn't initially made with any regard towards Germany, but rather a mutual understanding between the two powers. France would recognize the UK's control over Egypt, and the UK would recognize French hegemony of basically the rest of North Africa from there, Algiers and Morocco namely. In a few years, Britain would also begin to make nice with Russia by solving the disputes in Central Asia, primarily in Persia, permanently. The French and Spanish would divvy up Morocco between them, with the French getting the majority, obviously, and Germany would respond in its second act of aggression. the May 1905 Moroccan crisis. Kaiser Wilhelm II would sail to Morocco just as these deals were being finalized and would give a keynote speech with the Sultan in front of a large crowd crying out for Moroccan independence from foreign oppressors and that Morocco should remain independent and free from influence. This was an attempt to undermine French legitimacy and to drive a wedge between the British and French relationships by giving the Entente Cordiale a strenuous test with regards to the legitimacy of their agreement. It would have the exact opposite effect, as you might already imagine. The French and British, already uneasy by the German build-up, would be pressed closer than they would at any point in history. While it should be nothing formal, Britain began seriously considering Germany a threat at this point and would, more as an act of informal policy and general thinking than anything else, lean towards supporting France in a theoretical European conflict. The third major event would be the coming of the famous dreadnought, with one pictured here. The coming of the dreadnought shook the naval world so much so that every battleship in recent memory before it became known as pre-dreadnoughts. They would completely and utterly outclass anything any other nation was fielding. Their range and their firepower and the new engines and armor was like a fencing sword facing up against a claymore. And it would reset, so to speak, the naval arms race between Britain, Germany, and the world as a whole. You see, Britain's policy was called the two-power standard, that is, having as many ships as its next two highest powers combined. They were a naval nation and they had naval hegemony. This gave Germany its first real shot, as both were starting from a blank slate, essentially, to create a fleet that would legitimately contest the British in the North Sea region. It should be noted that dreadnoughts were not exactly long-range fighters, which made them useless for colonial protections. They had one use, which was attacking the British fleet in the North and Baltic Seas. The Germans would begin an unprecedented build-up, building dozens upon dozens of these ships and constantly making orders for more. All these tensions would finally culminate in 1911, which was the second Moroccan crisis. Those Germans were back for revenge, and it would totally work this time, right? No. The Moroccans would rebel against French rule, and the French were going to send troops to protect its interest. Kaiser Wilhelm, always the opportunist, would seize the situation by the proverbial horns and send the gunboat, the SMS Panther, to be backed up by the SMS Berlin, shortly after to go protect German trade interests. Let's call a spade, however. Germany sent warships to go intervene in a conflict between France and a country which had, in the very conference Germany called for in 1905, determined to remain under French influence. Germany would also demand territorial concessions in sub-Saharan Africa from the French, along with pulling out of Morocco entirely. Not only would Britain back up France, again driving them closer, Austria-Hungary wouldn't even give Germany diplomatic support, let alone military backing. Now, Germany had at this point completely abandoned Bismarck's strategy of balance, constantly giving conciliatory gifts or speeches or letters to rival powers to calm their nerves and keep everyone friendly, remaining content as not only a land power, but the land power of Europe. Not getting greedy about the idea of the superior German and German prestige, Germany was in a precarious position in the world, and Wilhelm II did everything in his power to do the worst possible options. France and Britain, who were formerly neutral at best, were driven into the strongest friendship they've had in their 1,000-year history. Britain, who in 1887 had no intent of getting involved in continental conflicts, was now drawing up plans for direct land intervention in Europe to assist the two powers, and it also had an agreement with France to provide its naval support in the event of a war with Germany. Even more astoundingly was how Germany drove Britain and Russia together. These were two nations who for all purposes wanted nothing to do with each other. Britain, who feared German control over the Baltic Sea, and a reciprocated fear from Russia, would begin to fix former grievances. Britain and Russia would go from hating each other in 1900 to informal military support and friendship in 1912, purely because of Germany's actions. Now, the last peg in Germany's coffin of war guilt was their actions in between June 28th and July 28th, 1914, the July Crisis. The general breakdown is Austria-Hungary used the assassination of Franz Ferdinand as a justification and premise for the long-standing objective of annexing Serbia. They knew, however, this would definitively mean war with Russia, which means they need German permission before doing this. Germany would give them the infamous blank check, essentially telling the Austro-Hungarians to do whatever they want with Serbia and tacitly accepting war. Austria-Hungary would send Serbia, who to this day has absolutely no hard link to the assassins and by all accounts cut ties with the Black Hand well before the killing, an ultimatum. A list of concessions Serbia would have to agree to, which amounted to essentially Serbia becoming a puppet state. Serbia would obviously decline, Russia would begin to mobilize, Germany would declare war. Not only would Germany declare war, it was their strategic plan that sealed the deal of them being perceived as the aggressors. Fearing their encirclement, they wanted to strike at France with everything they had and knock them out immediately. Infamously, it would be giving 950 hours or 40 days, no more. To do this, they couldn't just go through the border and push the French back. They would need to crush the French with total encirclement. This meant attacking through neutral Belgium. And this is a topic that goes into the evil discussion that I'll talk about briefly. But needless to say, Belgium had absolutely no ties to the French or Russians or Germans or anyone for that matter. They were sitting there by themselves, and Germany saw them as a convenient stepping stone to knock the French out faster, so they invaded this completely uninvolved power without provocation. This would be the primary accusation as to the claim of German aggression. Someone who was merely defending against two fronts would not declare war, and then immediately perform a massive offensive through an uninvolved neutral country for the express intent of encirclement and annihilation of the enemy army. That is aggression, full stop. So why is Germany seen as evil then? Aggression doesn't always equal evil. I mean, people start wars all the time, right? The evil German comes from the treatment of the Belgians and the invasion. The German high command had this fantasy of the Belgians putting up a single valiant defense to secure their national honor and then just rolling over in the face of an obviously superior military force. So they centered their entire plan around the Belgians, allowing them to use their roads, their railways, their cities, and their fields without any kind of resistance. And the Belgians did not roll over. They would perform a heroic extended siege, which would stun the German advance for days when it was supposed to last a couple of hours at most. When the Germans finally got past all those forts and into Belgian country, they found something horrifying. The bridges were blown up, the railways were destroyed, rocks were detonated in streets, creating roadblocks. Snipers would sit in trees and in bushes and in hilltops and in church towers and pick off Germans incessantly. It was more or less a guerrilla war, and the Germans had no way to deal with it. It slowed down their advance dramatically, and many would say it saved the French the war as it gave them enough time to organize at least some form of defense to counteract this surprise attack. The Germans didn't take kindly to this delay, and they would respond harshly. Harsh doesn't even do it justice. The Germans would commit officer-sanctioned war crimes out of petty frustration, and there is no other way to put it. If your village had a sniper in a building that shot one of our officers, then your entire village was burned to the ground. Priests would be shot in the street, priests that tried to give fellow wanted Belgians some safety. Entire towns would be lined up, women and children included, and shot and thrown into mass graves, or even just left there. Hundreds of people at once at times. Again, this was not a case of rogue men coming back frustrated from a battle and releasing tension. This was officer sanctioned. The generals in high command knew full well what was going on, and either let it happen or actively encouraged it depending on the men, as it was seen as a way to break the Belgian resistance spirit. Maurice Triffin would recall an execution saying the Germans marched in two columns down the deserted street, those on the right aiming their rifles at the house on the left, and inversely, all with their fingers on the trigger ready to fire. At each door, a group stopped and riddled the houses, especially the windows, with bullets, almost as if to change the routine. Other soldiers threw grenades and small bombs into the cellar of the homes. Corporal Franz Steving, 3rd Company, 178th Infantry Regiment, noted a similar experience. We pushed on house by house, we arrested the male inhabitants, they were summarily executed in the street. Private Kurt Rasch said that his purpose was to level everything in sight and to make one part of the city left of the Maas disappear from view. The Nantes has fallen, everything burned to the ground. We shoot the men, plunder and burn down the houses. The Nantes inhabitants lay about in heaps. The treatment of the Belgians was nothing short of horrific, and it would be the death blow to any hope Germany had of coming out of this war without having a book thrown at them if they were to lose. The Belgians, which were an innocent and uninvolved party, would be immediately and overwhelmingly invaded by an already expansionist, imperialistic, and aggressive power, and its people who wanted and knew nothing of war would be slaughtered in the streets by Germans who saw enemies and rifles everywhere. That would be the narrative presented at the peace conferences, and honestly, is it wrong? Thank you for watching.